Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a little heads up of what's coming. You all know this event is really due to Richard Cook. So I'm going to tell you the beginning of the beginning. But you have to wait a few minutes. All right. Let's see if we can. Oops. I left the clicker. Dave, tell me the clicker. Okay, thank you. Did it work? Here we are. We're here to talk about finding patterns, pattern finding. Right? Incident response turns out to be really hard work. And learning about incident response is really, really hard cognitive work because it involves pattern finding. Finding patterns that underlie and explain the seemingly infinite variety of the real world in the different settings, the different incidents, the different technologies, the different organizations. Yet underneath it all are regularities, phenomena, patterns that apply in all these different worlds, even laws. We have laws. Now, we have a different kind of law than most places because laws in cognitive work and adaptive systems have an odd quality. In math, they're called control laws. And what that means is you can violate the law, but you can't escape the consequences when you violate the laws. Things happen that you don't like. And then you start doing the game, right? Oh, it's that organization, right? Our cloud service ran fine. So what we're going to talk about, look, this is a very smart crowd. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little woods watching people watch people at work. This comes from my address in 1999 for president of the Human Factors Society. And so I'm watching you watch your people do incident reviews, watching the people who did the incident, right? Okay, we got that clear, all the levels? And where are we going to be? And guess what? There are patterns at each of those levels, right? Because what we're going to be doing is talking about patterns about patterns. And so what is the first pattern I want to tell you about? People come to me and they go, Dave, because they have this hint that somewhere in my past there's a secret that I was a psychologist. I started out that way, but luckily we escaped. Though I've had to keep escaping from different labels because then they called me an engineer, and then Richard said, don't dare let the people in the hospital know you're an engineer, right? And then it kept going, so then we invented cognitive engineering, and then we invented resilience engineering, so I'm not sure what I'm going to have to invent next so that nobody with an axe catches me. And I don't run as fast as I used to. So what do? Right? They see people do things that don't fit their model of the world, and they go, Dave, can you explain what people did? Right? And what do I say? It's okay. We've seen this before. Now, context matters, though. Incident response anywhere, right, is the same as incident response everywhere. Well, almost, right? Context matters. Each world has its unique attributes, tooling, context, but the general patterns emerge. And what do they emerge from? Actually, the secret ingredient in this is the diversity, right? Through that diversity and variation, you see the patterns. And for us, what's the best source of seeing the patterns? Incidents, right? Because that's where the model of how you thought the world worked gets revealed as the world doesn't really work that way. And that's recognizing that and updating, revising, reframing, reconceptualization is the essence of the kind of learning that we're talking about, and that I'm going to talk about. There's lots of varieties of learning. And I'm pretty sure that machine learning has nothing to do with any of them. But that's okay, and that's a talk for another day. Okay. How did this all start? 34 years ago, I moved to Ohio State, and I ran into this guy called Richard Cook. And he came to me and said, Dave, nobody will publish this paper I wrote about an incident in the operating room. Things didn't go well, and it was an adverse event. There were bad consequences. It was, in your world, an outage that affected customers who were important and called up your bosses and said, why isn't that service back? Hurry up. And he had titled it Cognitive Tunnel Vision in the Operating Room, an analysis of a case using a frame model. He, on his own, had dug up some stuff, even though he had been a computer scientist and then gone to medical school and was now on a research rotation in an anesthesia department, hanging out in the operating room, watching things, and he realized, oh, wait a minute, this is going badly wrong. And instead of just going, that was a bad day, or whatever, or blaming the surgical team, or whatever, or talking about it in the morbidity and mortality meeting, in which case they would have blamed the resident, not the surgeon. That's supposed to be a bigger laugh. Or were you afraid to laugh because you're scary? It's about healthcare issues you might have. Right? And so it was, how do I deal with this? No one would publish it. No one wanted to learn. No one saw the incidents as a source of information about how their system worked or how it could work differently to be better, more robust and resilient in the way we would talk today. Well, what had I been doing? Hopefully you're reading this slide, noticing something. What had I been doing? Well, I started in 1979 after the 3 Mile Island accident, right, trying to look at incidents, accidents, and also the introduction of AI, right? And one of the things we were studying was a phenomenon that has been noted for 100 years called fixation. So his tunnel vision was just an attribute of this larger pattern, a sub-pattern of fixation, right? And so what did I see when I looked at people trying to understand a dynamic system that's deteriorating? Anomalies are happening. What should I do? The procedures aren't really complete, or they're not helping, right? We realized it was easy for people to get stuck on one view of the situation and not revise. That was the key finding. They didn't revise. Now, when I met him, I was writing up a corpus of cases. This is an important point, one of the take-homes. Corpus, a set of cases for diversity so that we can, right, see the underlying patterns. And a colleague in Belgium, Veronique de Keyser, the grande dame of French language human factors, had been seeing fixations too in different industries, different settings with different technologies. And so we worked out a series of sub-patterns by which fixation played out in complex worlds as opposed to the kind of experimental settings that had been studied in the early 20th century. So we were able to see patterns and sub-patterns. And so Richard latched onto that. Now, what's the other lesson from this? You might have noticed, looking at the slide, they had no bloody idea what to do with his paper. And they stuck it in a session called neuromuscular transmission. They weren't interested in learning at all. Now, to make things happier, by 1991, we got calls from medical journals saying, hey, you got any more of those cool cognitive technology kind of papers about, human-computer interaction? That was really interesting. This is really becoming important. Would you have any more to send us? Now, we went on, and what's the first study we did together? Because we managed to get a little money. Richard isn't here, so I can make all these asides because he can't roll his eyes at me. So I made sure we got some money. Richard, thanks for all the help. So we could pay him, because he wasn't a real doctor. He wasn't a practicing clinician yet. We had to pay him. The theme came back as to why he came into your world. Blame John and me, and Dave, and Morgan Collins, and a few other people. Zoran, who isn't here now. And what did we do? We did a study of a corpus of incidents, a naturally occurring one, the morbidity and mortality meeting. And what was our goal? We were studying incidents. Most of their incidents were adverse events, right? And our project was, what's expertise in anesthesia? So what you do to make your system work and to learn how you make your system work, the pattern, so you can reinforce those patterns, was there. It wasn't a study of error. It was a study of expertise by looking at incidents. And of course, our key finding was it's about anticipating bottlenecks ahead. Right? It was the ability to anticipate, even though those might still be on an absolute scale low probability. And being prepared in case it happened. Because if things went south and you weren't prepared, getting everything together to handle the crisis was already too late, and you were unlikely to handle it well. So one of the lessons of resilience engineering emerged right off the bat. And we, of course, weren't the first ones to find that. And of course, nobody in anesthesia would publish it in the early 90s. The lesson of my life has been we've had to battle. All right, so we have one picture. We're just going to keep showing this picture and talk about it. It's pattern-centered inquiry. It's what I started doing when I walked out of a university laboratory doing experiments badly, which is why I didn't go on and continue to be an experimental psychologist. I found another niche that I was better at, right? Because I'd learned too much all the limits of experiments. And went, how do I confront the complexity of a control room when things in the dynamic process being controlled that's very risky, provides a valued service, is deteriorating and falling apart? And we started building the first model of anomaly response and other things. So what happened in 1989 with Richard and I, he was in the operating room observing incidents. He pulled out a particularly interesting one because he could connect it to a pattern. He was doing pattern finding. And for that to happen, he had to have some pattern priming. He had to know something about some of the phenomena, the generalities that exist, so that he could go, oh, I see a version of this over here. Well, I had been looking at it with clumsy automation and AI. Oh, by the way, when I was doing this stuff in the early 90s, one of the secrets on the projects we had on AI and people and emergencies was because the AI of the time fixated. It got stuck and couldn't revise. And of course, what did the computer scientists say? Oh, just rerun the algorithm again. You're like, no, it's a dynamic world that keeps changing. And your interventions keep changing it because you can't wait to figure out what's going on without acting because it's falling apart and bad things are starting to happen. In fact, the problem is changing and the problem is getting worse if I don't do something. So fixation, revision, reframing was a pattern emerging from both of these contexts, and we could coordinate them and put out a pattern base of fundamentals, of laws. And those laws come out in things like the anomaly response thing and other rules, laws about how cognitive systems work. Oh, that's what I wrote because people kept ignoring the laws, so I wrote a pamphlet. Right? Remember, right? How do complex systems fail? Computers were happy, so we decided to go retro on them. Right? Richard had the idea. We go retro. We hand you a piece of paper. Here's a pamphlet. Take it home. Mark it up. There's not many of these physical left. You can get it online at ResearchGate. All right? There's a couple newer laws missing that I should add to it, but here it is. Probably the last surviving physical copy from 2000. So we're trying to connect general findings, general laws to specific operating situations. Well, why do that? Just fix the situation, make it go better. Because you need guidance to escape the unending variety. Otherwise, you're chasing the tail of technology change, organizational change, growth, et cetera. So you need, one of the most practical things is a good theory. Now, there's not many good theories that give you the practical guidance about how to do things better. But that's what we were trying to build up in the pattern base. So you can read it, a little bit of this You can see the basic approach to it. Here's the other prop. We do have copies of this here, and Christine will be happy to share one if you want to take it. You can also look at it online or whatever, but this is, we're drawing from for this talk, is this little pamphlet on pattern finding, pattern priming. So who would like one? There you go. Throwing things is always fun. What's pattern-centered inquiry? Well, people in the software world kind of know Christopher Alexander. I don't know how I stumbled on him when I was in grad school, but I immediately seized on this as the way to make progress when I confronted the complexity of the real world. Remember, one of our starting principles was how people adapt to cope with complexity. I had to adapt to cope with complexity. Again, a few layers of patterns on patterns on patterns. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, right? And it describes, this is very important and often missed, it describes solution paths for that problem in such a way that you can use this approach a million times over without ever doing it in the same way twice. So pattern finding isn't simply about, oh, gee, there's a problem over there. Look, I can tell you, we've seen this before, you're screwed. No, we've seen this before, so we know something about what you should do. We know what kinds of strategies work. We know about some of the dead ends. Right? We know about some of the middle ground where innovation is possible, because as you innovate solutions, what are you doing? You're helping us understand the patterns more deeply, more fundamentally, understanding them as laws of how this world works. And we can characterize, if you do it, if you violate the law, this is the bad stuff that's going to happen that we all say we don't want to have happen. So the patterns generalize. They capture relationships. It's not the thing, it's the relationships and the layers of relationship that recur even as the elements that specify the pattern change. All right? And so we can talk about the operating room and a control room and space shuttle mission control and all of your settings and just the variety within all of your settings. Okay. Sidebar time. Everybody uses the word patterns. Again, you can always use the Princess Bride. I'm not so sure you know what that word actually means. All right? And I illustrated it here with something that might look familiar. Here's a pattern. It's a dynamic pattern. It has a variety of sub-patterns built into it. You have a system that is supposed to be working. It's a dynamic system. It does something significant. Therefore, the loss of it bears risks and consequences for stakeholders. And a surprise happens, and it starts to deteriorate. Right? And who's going to intervene? What's going to intervene as our systems grow in complexity? That might be some automated system. It might be a partner. It might be a colleague. It might be another group in your team, in your organization. Are they acting? Do they know what's going on? Oh, there's an intervention. Did it work? Did they do it poorly? Wait a minute. Right? And then you start to see a recovery. Oh, have you ever overshot on the recovery and created a new problem? Anybody raise their hand? I can't see you, so I don't know who you are. Oh, my goodness, there's an awful lot of you had this happen. I didn't know that was going to happen in your experience base. So what's a pattern? A pattern is what emerges from relationships between elements, and it's not about the elements. Right? The elements don't care. The subjective figure is a great example. But take a simple one to start with. We put 3 lines together in the right way, and a higher level emergent property pops out, closure. Or we put them together in a different way, and we see a volume, even though it's a flat surface with just lines. Right? Simple examples of what a pattern is about, relationships. And of course, subjective figure is the pièce de résistance of patterns, right? There is no line marking the subjective contour. There are no elements, but the arrangement of other elements creates the figure. They serve as a background to create the figure. Figure background, fundamentals here. The pop-out effect, the configuration superiority. You can know more, see more, perform better because of the way the configuration signals things to you that's simply trying to process things element by element. Wait a minute, does this apply to you? How how many trend plots do you look at as an incident begins? How many do you call up? Time series, how many are in your system? Is it in 5 figures or only 4 figures? Right? Data overload, configure, okay, all this stuff applies. Oh, it happens with expertise. Here's a study we did. We were supposed to do it on a space station, but they got delayed in building it, so we did it in the operating room. We could see the same pattern in a different setting, right? Telemetry, how do you make sense of telemetry? A series of events are happening. Here's a relationship one, and we could do it with people at different experience levels. And so people who could see the pattern, had the experience and expertise to see the pattern, could see the relationship between the 2 key vital signs and go, when they are diverging, because that's unusual, if they're going bad, they usually go bad together, too low or too high. Right? If I'm a little excited because mine's going too high, especially right now, at a couple different pattern levels. But to diverge, one high, one low, is unusual and significant, and it marks a special pattern that requires a special way to treat them. And that's what the experienced people saw. Well, the other ones who are just tracking the change, oh, that's going up, oh yeah, that's going up, we should do something about that, and they were going to respond one by one, which is not the way you're supposed to handle it. So expertise matters in patterns. But how do you get the expertise to see patterns? Experience. People, right now, the IT industry thing of let's cut the experienced people is, oh, I've seen this before, and I can tell you how this story goes. They're going to need someone like you back. Here's the one I showed to start. Okay, so aside, done. Let's go back. Pattern-centered inquiry. Right? What are the patterns driving all this? Well, let's take a sequence. All right, there's always a backstory of patterns you start from. So I get involved in the aftermath of the Columbia Space Shuttle accident. And what do I write up? I go, oh, I see a bunch of patterns. What's one of the patterns? Fragmentation across unit boundaries. Well, how did that matter? Well, because they didn't coordinate and talk to each other, they treated a new risk that was outside their model of potential harm to the orbiter and the people on board. And they were able to say, there's no risk, there's nothing new here. When in fact, the debris strikes on launch were 100 times more energy than anyone thought possible. They were happening in a different phase of flight, striking different parts of the vehicle. It was way outside anything they had analyzed. Therefore, there was no way to know what the risk was. In fact, the presumption would have been, this sounds riskier than we had thought. But they couldn't see it because of the fragmentation in the organization. So, right, I had a pattern base, a new situation. I'm able to use that priming to look at it and go, oh, look what I see in this that we can talk about as a general principle and talk about solution strategies. So then what happens? We get involved with you guys. And what do? First thing we do is build a corpus of incidents from diverse organizations and situations and things. Then it has a nice side effect of making everything anonymous too, right? So we can all share more safely. And what do we see? Well, it's kind of in the Stella report, but we chose not to push it because there was so much else we needed to cover, we couldn't do it all. But hints in there are saying, right, that we have a multi-party problem. We have fragmentation at the boundary. Well, guess what? When we did that, what's been the trend since? Right? More and more reliance on software from other organizations to make you more effective and productive at building valued services, right? One upon another, sideways connected, up, down connected. So this starts to appear more. Now, in the process of all this, what were we doing? We're building resilience engineering, so what are we doing? We're pulling out more and more fundamentals. So by a little bit before the Stella report, what do we have out? There's 3 ways adaptive systems fail. There's 3 ways adaptive systems fail. You should all know the 3 ways adaptive systems fail, because no matter how they fail, it ends up in the end being 3 of those. We mentioned the 3rd one, getting stuck to start, when I met Richard. Now, we didn't know there were 3 at that stage. It took us a while to learn from incidents too. 24 5 bloody years to put this together. 89 to 2011 to put together what we saw when we started, but didn't know we had seen it. Working at cross purposes is the second one. We've heard it mentioned already in talks this morning. So now we have, with change and growth, now we see it as a more common and fundamental new challenge to tackle. And we'll hear about that more in a talk this afternoon and a follow-up discussion. So we'll see what kinds of patterns and sub-patterns we can pull out. Again, remember the original Christopher Alexander quote. Seeing patterns is about seeing new solution paths. It's about insight. The pattern finding is a process of insight, which is hard to do. People can do it, but they need help. What kind of help do they need? Diversity of experience. What is one of the things that Richard and I noticed about you as a community is it's amazing the diversity of experiences and knowledge that you bring to the table. It's almost universal across this population. And that is an enormous strength to drive insight. Here's one. This guy, John Allspaw. He starts reading. He does guerrilla reading. Now, why would somebody doing DevOps go and read something about anomaly response in control rooms and emergencies and space shuttle operate? Oh, my goodness. In operating rooms. But somehow he did. You'll have to ask him why. Maybe it was too many margaritas, but all of a sudden, right, he's able to see this intersection of pattern finding and pattern priming, getting a hint and reading these things going, oh, that happens in my world too, despite the fact the pattern had emerged from other diverse settings. And so safing actions, hypothesis exploration. Marissa Bigelow's thesis was exploring that in your world, based on exploring hypothesis exploration in other settings, allowed her to do it and expand on the patterns in your setting. Joint activity, we've seen references to that paper 2005 where Gary Klein and I had no idea that we were writing a paper that would be influential in critical digital services, right? No idea whatsoever. By the way, like several of the things Richard and I have done over the years, you have noticed its significance and act on it way more than the people it was developed for and who paid the bills. So thank you very much. You got it for free. So, you can pick up drinks tonight if you like. No, I forgot. Indeed's already doing it. The Stella report. Nora put up Richard trolling me. And so you got to know the backstories on all these things. Richard put that in to troll me because he had seen the drafts of the theory of graceful extensibility and the way I'd written it up, and there was another thing going on, another study we're doing for another world, and so he put that in at the beginning and he was actually out to make me mad. And instead I added a word because he did one thing wrong. So I had to add the word rapidly at the end because he messed it up. So that's how I got back at him. But what did we do there, right? Our ability to take things like joint activity, pattern finding. Notice the last one. We're going to switch our levels of patterns, about patterns. We're going to do patterns about how to find patterns. Learning how to learn. One of Richard's themes that was there at the very beginning because he did what he thought was obvious that everybody would want to know about and follow up like he did and change, find those new solution paths because these kinds of getting stuck happened in the operating room. And we would care about not having adverse events because we were delayed in recognizing what's deteriorating in a patient's physiology. And they didn't. Right? Learning processes, right, can work in a way where what you're learning is misconceptions. That you can have experiences that reinforce misconceptions, that make it harder to change. Right? Misconceptions versus reconceptions. So we had things, cost of coordination. Laura McGuire's dissertation, coming up to speed. We heard about that from Chad. And there is a great backstory to that will blow your minds about how science doesn't work the way the textbooks say. My favorite, Strange Loops, which is everywhere, and it's more than circular dependencies, and we still haven't taken up the challenge of defining the strategic paths forward there. But they, I think, will have to be solved if we're going to deal with the multi-party problem. One great one that Richard realized as we were doing the discussions was dark debt. And it's always great when the label just leaps out that captures the essence of something. It's not the technical debt you know about, it's the technical debt you've taken on that you don't know is there. That's what gets you in trouble. And it's a wonderful idea that we still need to follow up more. How to do postmortems, model updating, revision is all through all this stuff, right? Model updating, revision, reconceptualization is what it means to learn how to learn. When did Richard have that as a title of a paper? 1998. Actually, that picture wasn't from 1989. We didn't have any from us back then, so it's from us in the patient safety movement in, that was probably taken in 96 or 97. So obviously we looked so much older there. And by the way, you did notice he didn't have a bow tie on, right? It was something that came later just to fool all of you and thinking he was smarter. We always had to poke each other a little. Insights arise at that intersection of the interplay back and forth between the concrete, the expression in context, in this particular place, and being able to connect that to the universal, the laws, the general patterns that are playing out. We go back and forth between the two. That's the engine. And if you bring in that diversity of experience, right, you bring the diversity of perspectives on it, and then you see things you couldn't see before. And as John Allspaw likes to say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. When have that feeling, you know you've had a good insight. So, all right, we're supposed to do practical things. Richard would be mad at me right now because I haven't told you too much practical yet. I'm talking at the big picture level. Woods, come on, they have to do stuff tomorrow. They do real work. They don't just sit around and talk about it like you. Well, when he was really mad at me, he was more quiet about it and just said, "No, David." So that's what happened when I did the Adobe talk. I had this whole thing worked out, and he just looked at me and said, "No, David. Go back and do it again." And he was right. He was completely right. Not all the time, but that time. So here's the three things. If you're going to The patterns about finding patterns in incident response tell you three things you should always remember and do. Most of you do it. It's evident in the discussions and the progress we've made. Right? It's about sets of incident. It's not one incident at a time. So you have to look at this incident that's happened that calls attention to it in the context of other kinds of incidents related to. Second, contrast. Once you have a set, a corpus, right, you can do contrasts along different kinds of dimensions. But to have those dimensions, you need some pattern base so that you can expand the diversity of perspectives that you bring in order to see contrasts and have insights about what you didn't see before. Right? That means you have to have priming, which means you have to have some patterns, which means you have to read my papers. Right? Now, I'll pay back and say, if you need a copy of Joint Cognitive Systems patterns, I will just send you the electronics. No charge. You don't have to buy the book. God knows if you can even find the book anymore. I'm happy to send it to you. But no, you have to have other sources of information that generalize so that you have something to draw on to escape the unending variety and change that's going on in your world. Right? Because your world is driven by growth. Because you provide valued services. So people adapt to work to extract the value for their purposes from the services you provide. Right? If you're not growing, the company is not going to keep going very long. And if you're growing and they're adapting to the growth of the valued service, notice we're going around, what are they going to do? They're going to change everything. So what did work and what you did need to know to understand and do incident response well is going to change. What did we illustrate that with? The multiple parties problem. It was always there. It was always there. Now, but it was a minor theme until more stuff came along. And now it became a major theme. I thought they were trying to tell me I'm supposed to stop. Well, I would ignore them anyway. And it changes incidents from a problem to an opportunity. It changes what kinds of incidents are informative to have that opportunity to learn. And what we need, and we sometimes talk about, is patterns about patterns about patterns for learning from incidents, which is how do we change the blunt end of the system so that they're oriented and see the benefit of learning, right? Because their system is valuable. It does create advantage for customers, which is going to lead to change and growth, and therefore change the kinds of incidents, the kinds of skills. But behind that, we'll know there's a pattern base we can draw on so we can look at them and say, you know, upper management, we've seen this before. And then they won't realize you're actually talking about them and why they're stuck in the wrong model yet again. I am almost at the end. You may have noticed at the top was this word corroboration. So how does this kind of science work? Right? It works by collecting a series of observations, most diverse in form and content, to inform the prepared mind. By the way, that's Sir Francis Bacon from the 1600s. That's the dawn of science. Fundamentally, science is about pattern finding, pattern priming, and by looking at it across settings, across kinds of changes, across technologies in our world, that's the form of corroboration we get that gives us confidence that these are law-like generalizations, these are in fact laws about how the world works, that these are in fact hard constraints and fundamentals, that we can actually have theories and theorems. Well, that really sounds scientific, right? Doesn't it? That we have theorems? But there really are that matter here and drive this. So this allows us to generalize across settings and make these law-like. All right, so I gave you 3 practical things to remember: sets, contrasts. That requires priming from knowing something about the pattern base, right? And you're not going to know enough about the pattern base by yourself. Remember, I said we had the pattern, and we didn't realize what it meant for another 25 years to what the super pattern, the meta pattern really was, right? Even the specialists don't know all the patterns. Your homework is coming. So what's the other thing Richard focused on as a pattern about finding patterns is learning how to learn. So we're up to at least 3 levels, right, on our patterns about patterns about patterns. And learning how to learn has to be diversity-centered and synthesis-oriented. It has to inform reframing and reconceptualization. It's all about the ability to see that your model of the world doesn't match the world you're in, the gap between work is imagined, work is done, a phrase that emerged in the 2004 first meeting on resilience engineering, which is really just the first proper English translation of an old finding in French human factors. Dates back to the early 70s. So there's 5 things Richard highlighted when he talked about learning how to learn. Takes effort. You can't get it for free. Take that, you machine learning people. You can't get it for free. It takes real contact. Why? Because there's a skill to it. And that skill has to only grow through the exercise of that activity. You're not great at it at the beginning. You have to work the muscles. And we've seen this all in the growth of this community and the way you have worked with each other to build that skill set. And how do you grow the skill set? Technique. It's all about technique. And you share techniques. You've heard about techniques. We develop them. We build tooling to support the techniques. It's about the techniques. So it's effortful. It's skill-based, so technique matters. It's part of expertise. And it takes expertise. Right? Expertise goes beyond skill, generally because we can talk about it better. So we can share it with each other verbally. Right? We can dissect it a little bit. And that's nice, but it works best on a base of skills. And it takes effort to build the skills. It takes experience to build the expertise. Not free. And it is an expertise, and the skill can't grow, and it can't have an impact unless you can share it. It develops through sharing and interaction, right? And it grows and has an impact in the world through sharing and interaction. So it's not private. So in a sense, we're talking about this mechanism, and yet this mechanism for learning, right, is fundamentally embedded in our interactions with each other. Another pattern. And ultimately, the kind of learning we're talking about is the ability to revise, update, reconceptualize. That's what matters. That's what didn't happen when Richard and I met and talked about getting stuck in the operating room and one way of looking at the problem to the detriment of the patient on the table that day. Here's one example of what he wrote about the patient safety movement 2 years before the mass. 2 years into the patient safety movement, he wrote out, gee, you did the initial thing of, oh, we could learn all this stuff. And then you know what happened? You violated all 5 of those. They stopped thinking of it. They stopped, oh, this is too hard. This is too effortful. Let's make it easy. Let's dilute it. Let's move it to the lowest common denominator. You don't have to use machine learning algorithms to screw up learning. It's not about skill and technique. It's just about writing a procedure. What do you mean expertise? We got to get those experts under control. They go rogue. They use their expertise. Things are diverse. We have to have fiscal viability. And when we did a Harvard Kennedy School executive session with CEOs of hospital systems in 1998. Within the year of that planned effort of meeting with these CEOs, all but one had been fired. None of them were fired because of clinical issues. They were all fired because of financial problems in the hospital system. Their ability to understand and support the clinical work at the sharp end had nothing to do with it. What did he say after 2 years is, you don't really know how to learn. You are not engaging in any of the fundamentals of the kind of learning we're talking about here. So there's barriers to learning of this kind we're mentioning. And learning can reinforce misconceptions, or it can open you up to the possibility of reconceptualization. What are the barriers? Oversimplification fallacies. My friends hate for me to use the word fallacy. Aren't we supposed to be blameless? I'm going, God damn it, there's some things in science, and you just have to say it's bloody wrong. There's laws, for God's sake. There's scientific laws. The reification fallacy. One you may have heard me say, it's all about the verbs. Stop using nouns. Yes, nouns are nice pointer words. Stop using categories. Medical world only uses categories and think they understand something. These are processes. They're dynamic, interconnecting processes. They're not a thing in the world. Right? They're a complex set of interacting dynamic things. The novelty inequality. Right? The novelty inequality. What's that mean? Well, we wrote about that. We never put a good name on it. We just called it hindsight bias back in, actually I first wrote about it in '83. And that's why we couldn't learn from accidents. Right? We were committing the oversimplification fallacies. Right? Well, what's the novelty inequality? It means when you analyze the event afterwards, you will see a certain amount of novelty that event presented to the people who tried to solve it. But the novelty the people in the middle of the situation faced, the potential novelty they faced, is always much, much bigger than the determined novelty after the fact. After all, 3 Mile Island, remember, this is 1979, $1980, right? 6 months and $60 million to figure out what was the right thing to do when operators who never knew that this kind of thing could happen took the wrong action, right? We'd all make much better decisions if somebody handed us $60 million. In fact, if they handed us $60 million, there's a whole bunch of decisions we wouldn't have to make anymore. Discounting, right? We have a chapter in the first resilience engineering book about discounting and all those. And you have heard me talk about that on other times or can see the talks. Again, it goes all the way back to behind human error. All these discounting process. What do? They're reinforcing misconceptions rather than confronting the dissonance that the world is saying, I don't work the way you think I do. Reconceptualize. But that's painful and hard to do. The component substitution fallacy. What? Wait a minute. Is your world perfect? Do you have infinite resources? I know you do computers, right? Aren't they infinite? Don't they do everything? No, the world everything has finite resources. Therefore, there's always trade-offs that had to be made. Therefore, when something goes wrong and you look back afterwards, what will you find? You'll find some component or subsystem weaknesses that mattered. And you'll go, oh, look at that. That's the cause. Then we're done. We'll fix that. What's that? That's a retreat. That's a refusal to confront. The message is every single event will identify weaknesses. Fixing weaknesses is a good thing to do. If you're going to chase all the weaknesses, what are you going to do? Run out of resources. Right? You have to step up a level and see the patterns to develop strategies forward that can work effectively to build robustness and resilience, despite the fact that the world is messy. Snafu is the natural state of the world, and resources are always limited. We work well because we confront snafu, and we do that through the adaptive capacity of people. We'll skip that. So here's your assignment. You are talented, knowledgeable, and we are here to share and stimulate more knowledge, more sharing, and so find patterns. Here's your assignment. From the discussions, interactions, the talks, etc., find patterns. Find new sub-patterns. What do you see now that you did not see clearly before? What elaborations of patterns have become visible to you recently or here or in the discussions? Which ones tantalize you? You can also use patterns as a language to pose questions, to solicit interaction in order to develop a better understanding. How have you added to your repertoire in your base of patterns so that you can be better primed as you see the variety and confront the variety of the world? So the first thing is find patterns. Second one, what facilitates learning? Learning in the sense we've talked about here, and what hampers learning as updating and revision? What facilitates insight? These are the learning questions we care about as a community committed to learning and recognizing the potential of tracking a diverse collection of incidents with a repertoire of patterns in order to see new insights and new solution paths as we grow and continue to provide valued services, where loss of those services start to become critical, right? Safety threatening, and even existential. So those are your two assignments. Laura has set up a thread in the LFI conference Slack channel so that you can put your ideas, what things you've noticed. By the way, I wrote this down on the slides on the airplane on the way here, added to it as a last step because I wanted to bring it home for you. And I walked in and I met someone. As soon as I walked in the hotel, we sat down to talk and we immediately came up with a new pattern or sub-pattern. So he already has his homework done. I can't see through the lights. Where are you? There he is. He already has it done. And we called it the the network pileup effect. And we're not sure that's the right name, but we have a way to describe it. He's going to put it in the thread. Because everybody wants an A. And by the way, if that doesn't scare you enough, because I'm a professor, so of course I'd say that, I do have one last thing to remind you to do your homework. Oops. Richard's watching. And he is no longer governed by the constraint of this universe that the view from every point of observation simultaneously reveals and obscures. He's in a place where that doesn't hold anymore, so he can see what you're doing, and he expects you to live up to your talent and give us some new patterns and some new methods to facilitate insight. Thank you very much.